Okay, so today we're looking at the senses of sacred scripture. These are going to be the high points. I'm going to go a little bit beyond the two senses that you need to know and talk about type and antitype as well. But for the most part, there are going to be two senses of sacred scripture that you need to know. The first one is going to be the literal, and the other one is going to be the spiritual. Okay, so make sure you know these, literal and spiritual. It's very straightforward. Now, in the literal sense, we need to differentiate between two categories. One is going to be the literal sense, as the name of the sense, and the other one is going to be literalistic. Now, the literal sense, we use it in theological terms a little different than the rest of the world. The rest of the world uses the literal sense. When you say, I literally fell down the stairs, what a person today means is, I actually did fall down the stairs. That is a fact. In Scripture, it means something a little bit different. Okay, for Scripture, the literal sense primarily means what the author intended to mean. Okay? So what did the author intend to mean? So give you an example. Somebody says it's raining cats and dogs outside. We all know what that means. It means it's raining really hard outside. Okay? Now, to understand it from a literalistic perspective, and I'm going to use the same example in a second. The literalistic sense, or aspect of the literal sense, is the words are taken at face value. Okay, so literalistic, to take that same example, that it is raining cats and dogs, the words taken at face value essentially means that there are indeed cats and dogs raining from the sky, which would be quite dangerous because then you'd want to run outside and catch them all. But you need to put this into perspective, like every other scriptural passage. What is a literal sense? Is it meant to be taken literal, or is it a literalistic sense? Sometimes the literalistic meaning is simply just that. Words are taken at face value. You shall not murder. Well, you can't really necessarily interpret it beyond that. However, to take it from a literal sense, well, you shall not murder, but then you add on other meanings behind that. You shall not kill, you shall not destroy a person's reputation, and so you can get more in depth with that. Now, there are three spiritual senses, and before we get to the spiritual senses, divvying them up, first thing you need to know about the spiritual sense is that all are based upon the literal sense. So literal sense is going to lay the foundation for us. Okay, without the literal sense, there can be no spiritual senses. Okay, so let's kind of go around the screen counterclockwise. So we'll start with allegorical. So allegorical sense. Essentially, the allegorical sense is it looks in the Old Testament and it considers how an event in the Old Testament points forward, or how does it foreshadow to a future event. So it considers how an Old Testament foreshadows a later event. Okay, we'll shrink that a little bit. Okay, so that is what allegorical is aiming at, and I'll give you an example of each one of these in a minute. Next one is moral sense. Moral sense, again, it's very straightforward. It looks at the heroes and it considers how our heroes models to our faith. So how can we learn a lesson from them about living our life the way we need to live it? Anagogical sense, a little different, probably the deepest of the three. It looks at sacred scripture and it asks the question, or it tries to determine, what is it about sacred scripture that reveals heavenly realities? So in essence, it's relating us back into heaven. So the heaven is where our home is, so eventually that's what we're trying to get there. Examples. So allegorical. Old Testament pointing forward to a future event, foreshadowing. So let's draw a mountain here. There's our mountain. And I'm going to use this example for this scenario for two. And we have Abraham going up to sacrifice Isaac, or at least attempt to sacrifice Isaac. So we're going to have Isaac here. And on Isaac, he is carrying a piece of wood. Okay, and Abraham is right behind him. Okay, you have to give him a rocking beard, because that's what old people have, apparently. And since he's going to try to sacrifice, we'll give him a sword. Or at least something that looks like a sword. Alright, and if we interpret this passage from an allegorical sense, allegorically it's pointing towards a future event, because as the scenario runs down, what's going to happen is eventually they're going to get to the top. Isaac is not going to be sacrificed, but instead they're going to have a ram take his place. Okay, and so what this unfolds as is kind of a foreshadowing of the future event that is we're going to know it as the crucifixion. Okay, Christ sacrifices. So you have the Father who is willingly giving up his beloved Son. All right, let me give you the second example. So that was allegorical. And let's keep this on here for the moral sense. So moral sense, looking at how this can be a hero of our faith, we see Abraham climbing the mountain with Isaac. And so one of the easiest interpretation is that, morally speaking, we can say, well, give God what it is to give God. So morally speaking, a lot of people will say, well, it's about trust. True. Definitely Abraham is trusting God in this by offering up his son to him. But there's another dimension of this that a lot of people often forget about, because maybe they don't dive into the text deep enough. And it's simply where Abraham has made his son into an idol. This is his idol, his beloved, his only begotten and beloved son. And so God is essentially asking Abraham, will you give your idol up to me? All right, so it has a dimension of sacrifice. All right, sacrifice to God. So morally, that is something that we can learn from this. And let us clear the screen. Now here, the next one I want to do, anagogical, we can have Joshua. So he looks a lot like Abraham and Isaac. So Joshua is along the Jordan River, and he is surrounded by his followers. I say followers, but the people who he's put in charge after Moses dies. Okay, so here are the people. Here are the Israelites, or Hebrews, if you would prefer, and they're about ready to cross into the Promised Land. So we'll label that as PL, as the Promised Land. Okay, so you have essentially God's family on the right side of the screen and the Promised Land on the left side of the screen, and a river running through the middle. How does this relate to heavenly realities? Okay, well, you have the people of God, or the family of God if you prefer, crossing into the Promised Land through essentially water. Okay, that connects us to the anagogical sense, to heavenly realities, where you have God's people, mainly the Christians, being baptized, and then later on, eventually making it into the heavenly Promised Land, or the real Promised Land.